I'm very pleased today to have our speaker, Dr. Natalie Bumgarner. Many of you may have been to her session at the state conference back in November, back in Columbus. She has her PhD in horticulture, and it just happens to be from OSU in 2012, so we're proud to call her a Buckeye. She is the UT Residential and Consumer Extension Specialist, focusing on Master Gardener programming, horticulture programming around the state. She did her research on vegetable production systems here at OSU, and after that, she was the research director and horticulturist for Crop King, which many of you know is up in Lodi, Ohio area. So again, the handout, go.osu/UT Microgreens. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to Dr. Natalie Bumgarner.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll get into the PowerPoint. I'm really glad to be here with y'all today. While Pam was talking, I reached behind my myself to show you what hangs on my wall in the office, so you'd know that there's always a little bit of Buckeye information around here. So, and I think that there may actually even be a Worcester picture or two in the presentation. So always enjoy getting to visit with some of my Ohio friends. The topic that we are going to visit about today is microgreens at home. And so my microgreens work probably began when I worked at Crop King. Most of what I did in school was actually in lettuce, right? But a lot of baby greens. And so when I started working in some of the greenhouse in the hydroponic world, then it even got smaller. And so I've had the opportunity over the last few years to do some presentations and educational programs and that publication in the area of microgreens. And speaking of that publication, that's a fun story because my co-author on that is actually a now graduated graduate student from here at UT, and she did her whole master's project on nutrient density and growth in microgreens. So there is a lot of research going on in that area right now. So for our visit today, we're just going to talk a little bit about the what and the why. Why exactly do we grow microgreens? A little bit about materials and tools and some of the most common crops. And then we'll just kind of talk about some of the basic practices that go along with those crops, a little bit about light, a little bit about media, a little bit about seed and harvest. And my goal is to not talk for the whole time, but to leave some time at the end so we can visit if y'all have any questions. So microgreens are something that over the last 8-10 years have probably been in the news a whole lot. And so we're seeing commercial production scale up in these areas. We're seeing a lot of opportunities, and a lot of that translates to the home grower as well. And so you can go to your farmer's market. You can actually buy these sometimes in some of the high-end grocery stores. A lot of even CSAs and things like that have the opportunity to have these tasty microgreens. So they're a cool new area of horticulture that's really been catching on, and they're very simple and straightforward to do at home. So as a quick overview, we're really talking about a crop that from start to finish you can accomplish in less than a month. A lot of these crops are in that 10 days to 2 week range. A lot of what I grow are the brassica family. And so arugula, broccoli, those types of cool season crops, we can churn out pretty quickly. There are a lot of options as far as what you can grow in. And I think one of the best things is that it can fit a whole range of production cycles. So certainly if you have a backyard greenhouse, then you are all set. But if you have a small light that you're starting some of your transplants on right now, or if you have a window that gets more than half a day's worth of sunlight, then you can absolutely start on a small scale. So it's something that's very scalable, young, not as young, a wide range of audience. And lots of times when I talk about this, I say, it's a great way to be introduced to gardening, because no matter what happens, it can all be fixed or replaced within a couple of weeks. So a really short cycle. So just a little bit about what exactly are we talking about when I say microgreens. This is actually a Worcester picture. So that's me and some of my baby lettuce. And we're probably most familiar, whether we buy it prepackaged in the store or whether we grow a lot of our own, we're probably more familiar with baby greens, right? So just a few inches of the leafy portion of a whole range of our leafy crops. We may also be familiar with sprouts. And so sprouts, we're eating both the shoot and the root portion as well as, you know, anything that's left of the seed and cotyledon, right? We're eating the whole thing. And microgreens kind of fall in the middle. So we are only eating the shoot portion. We're not eating any of the root portion, but it tends to be a whole lot smaller than baby greens. And so we can actually eat it, you know, on a range of spectrum. Some people will just eat the cotton. Some people will wait till we have true leaves that are showing through. So you kind of have a range of timing when it comes to microgreens. So right now there's actually quite a bit of research that's going on in the area of health properties. So I kind of mentioned that a little bit when I was talking about the fact that I was able to co-author that pub with Rosie Metallo. And so when we think about this as an indoor or as a greenhouse crop, there's lots of work that can go there. Can we change the LED lights and increase the nutrient density of some antioxidant compounds and pigments in the plant? And the answer is yes, we can. Sometimes the light can even increase just the soluble solids, right? The sugar or the sweetness. So there's been a lot of investigation in health properties and taste and flavor. There's probably been a little bit less research when we come to the food safety end. So as you might probably already know from kind of watching the news and being educated food consumers, one of the reasons that microgreens have taken off in the last few years is because there's been some food safety concerns when it comes to sprouts. We're talking about a plant that spends all of its time in moisture, right? And so this is probably an area that there needs to be more research in as far as where microgreens fit on that spectrum. But we as gardeners know that when we grow our own food, we're responsible for doing all of those best management practices. So clean water, clean seeds, clean media, clean hands, all of those things come into play, because when we're talking about crops that we generally eat raw, especially leafy material, we can't completely eliminate that risk. So we do need to be careful. So we'll keep that in mind. So with kind of that overview and the introduction, I've already hit a little bit on some of these why, but there's the flavor aspect. And so a lot of these are used as garnishes for meats, for salads. If you go to some restaurants, especially in more urban areas, you can find restaurants that solely focus on all microgreen salads. I think I was in one in maybe Santa Fe, New Mexico, or someplace out west. And because we're eating such a wide range potentially of crops, we can get a huge flavor profile. Everything from the strongest of our options, like cress, like arugula, those stronger peppery flavors, to the much more, innocuous flavors. Broccoli, lettuce tend to be some of those milder flavors. And so we can really have any combination of that. A lot of the reason why microgreens are used is because of their color. So whether it be beets or chard, like bright lights chard, you can get a whole range of color. There's lots of ways that they can add a huge novel interest as well as flavor. Then, of course, we just have the enjoyment factor. So I, as you already know, spent 7 winters in the northeast corner of Ohio. So I know how much psychological benefit you can get from just watching things grow and germinate. So in the wintertime, microgreens I actually keep a lot growing all the time. Sometimes I don't even eat them. I use them a lot when I teach botany, so that I can bring my USB microscope and look at those root hairs and things like that. So there's a lot of enjoyment just in growing fresh produce and having new live things constantly germinating in our own production area. Nutrition, I kind of already mentioned. For that, some of the research has shown us that in cotyledons of microgreens, we can actually have higher nutrient density than might be in that mature leaf that's grown out, and recorded in some of our USDA numbers. And then, of course, for the commercial grower, they grow it because they can sell it. And so there's a whole range of great ways that we can use microgreens. We're seeing some beets there, and chard and beets are some of the most flavorful, but also some of the most colorful. You can see a whole range of crops in that shot. This is one of my personal favorites. We can combine our microgreens with our fairy gardens, so who can beat that? And one of my favorite stories about microgreens, I told you that I grew a lot of them when I was working for Crop King. We were doing hydroponic research, and so I just had a lot of trials going on all the time. And I would just have just big crisper containers full of microgreens. And I went to visit my family. My folks live in West Virginia, and I had this big plastic container full of broccoli microgreens, and I was going to give it to my best friend because, you know, she's kind of a foodie, and so I knew she would enjoy it. Well, I forgot, and I, you know, went back to work after the weekend was over, and my mom called me a couple of days later, and she was like, I don't really know what those green thingies were that you left us in the refrigerator, but your dad really liked them. So even old cattle farmers can get in to microgreens. So now we're going to get down to the practical. We're going to talk a little bit about how we really do it, selecting the crop, a little bit about seed, then media, location, and a little bit about management. So this is just kind of broken into a couple of main categories between the easier ones to pull off and the potentially more challenging. So as you can tell, when you look at that easier list, a lot of what are the, you know, best ones right out of the gate are cool season greens. And so arugula, broccoli, radish, turnip were high here on the Brassicaceae family. Pak choy, mustard, lettuce, all of these germinate pretty quickly. They germinate pretty high percentage, pretty easily. And the nice thing about it is that their optimum germination temperature is, you know, in that 70 to 75 range. It's okay if we get down to 65, they'll still germinate fine. Even 60 degrees, it'll be okay. And so this fits well with a lot of our indoor house environments. We don't necessarily keep our house 78 degrees like basil would prefer for germination. So that's why a lot of the cool season crops work well. They also tend to be a little bit more forgiving sometimes when it comes to light levels. Then some of the potentially more challenging, and these kind of fall into potentially more challenging for a couple of reasons. Some because they're larger seeds that we have to soak or treat differently. So sunflowers and peas take sometimes a little bit extra management. Basil, amaranth, I guess I don't have amaranth on that list, but it could go there, are warm season crops, so they really do prefer a higher germination temperature. Basil's also a little bit slower. Carrots are also a little bit slower. Beets and chard grow well once you get them germinated, but you know, with that multi-seed, they're sometimes a little bit funny to get germinated. So all of these are doable, but I'd probably start with, when I do demonstrations, lots of times I do turnips, I do broccoli, I do arugula, red cabbage is really pretty. So those are some of the easiest ones to start with. And these I've kind of already given you an overview. So the upside of arugula is that it has a really rapid germination. You can literally see germination beginning oftentimes in less than 24 hours on arugula. I guess I couldn't go ahead and admit that one of the reasons why I love microgreens is because we don't cover them up with media. And so we can literally watch germination as it's happening. So some people who have grown a lot of arugula and are picky about it say that the flavor can actually depend upon the growth stage. So some people like to eat just the cotyledon. Some people like to wait till there's some true leaves. I don't actually cook all that much. So mostly I just grow things and weigh them and take pictures of them. So I'm probably not the best person to ask on that. Arugula can also be reasonably forgiving as far as light levels. So if you're trying it inside for the first time, that's a reasonable place to start. The other nice thing about arugula as a microgreen is that you can sprinkle just a little bit on your salad, and you can add a little bit of that taste, flavor profile where it's not overwhelming to you. Kale, I like to grow kale because I like a lot of the red kales, red Russian. Some of those are nice as a microgreen or as a very small baby green. It can be a little bit slower germinating than arugula, a milder flavor certainly, but great variation in color and texture. Mustards, I would probably put in the flavor profile of arugula, not surprisingly, but we also have some great like chartreuse, right? Some of the mizunas and mustards, some of the dark reds, so a beautiful range of colors. I already mentioned red cabbage. That's, of course, what we have in the background here. That's one of my favorites to grow as far as color profile. Broccoli is one of my favorites to eat, actually. So no cooking required. Lots of times I'll just eat a whole salad full of broccoli. Microgreens, pretty rapid germination, very mild. Napa cabbage is also mild like that. And pak choi is also a very mild. And pak choi tends to be kind of a larger plant. So you get pretty good yield out of pak choi if you get a good germination percentage. I guess I should make this as like my use with caution page. And so if you like that very peppery flavor of cress, then by all means, it can be a pretty simple, straightforward crop to grow in microgreens. I don't eat a lot of cress. It's just a little bit too strong for me. A few years back, I juiced cress, and it just kind of soured me on the whole thing. But it can grow well as a microgreen. Some other root crops to think about. So turnip is a really rapid germination. You probably would want to, instead of using seeds that are more for turnip root production, but for turnip leaf production. Carrots, I haven't really grown carrots very much. They take a little bit longer, they're slower germinating, and so I tend to do the faster cycle crops. A few others that are pretty common in microgreens, the various radishes. Of course, they're a larger seed, pretty fast germination, and the daikons have a nice mild flavor, so they would be one that would be a pretty easy starter. Lettuce, now, of course, I already showed you pictures of lettuce, so you know I am pretty fond of lettuce. I actually don't grow it a whole lot as a microgreen because it's not all that exciting. It can be, you can get a nice color profile out of lettuce, so that can be useful if you're mixing it, but it doesn't add a whole lot as far as flavor or texture, but it can be pretty fast. It's, you know, it's tender. It's not going to store very well. And then, of course, if you enjoy endive, you know, you can use lettuce's cousin as well. Beets and chard, I already mentioned this. They are, of course, actually multi-seed pods. So sometimes people pre-soak those a little bit or cover them with soil. Typically, we don't cover our microgreens with media. Actually, we don't use soil at all. I should replace that with media. But sometimes if they're a larger seed that we're afraid might not stay consistently moist, peas would be an example of one that we do cover with media. Even though beets and chard may be a little bit slower to germinate, may not be quite as high a percentage as we get with arugula and things like that, I would consider them worth the effort. I really like the flavor. If we're going to use very optimistic terms, we'll say it's very earthy. Some people would say it tastes like dirt, and you just can't beat the color that you can get out of a range of beets. So I think that beets and chard are both probably worth a little bit of extra time, but they might not be the first crop that I would try. I'd get my feet wet on some others. Their flavor intensity can be a little bit variable, so you know, try them out lightly. Probably the microgreen that is grown near the top of the list, especially as far as commercial production, is actually basil. And that's because it's a high value crop for producers to sell. And it is slower growing, right? So it's slower germinating, and it's just a smaller, slower growing plant. It has short stems. And I think I may have skipped over this note on one of the other slides, but basil especially would be one that no matter what container you use in, make sure that you fill that media close to the brim, because you're not going to be able to get in there and harvest very well with those short stems. Most importantly, basil is a warm season crop. So those upper 70s are going to be what really enables it to germinate the most quickly and the highest germination percentage. It's also chilling sensitive. So we don't have it growing outdoors when we're going to get, 48-degree nights and things like that. And it also doesn't store well in the refrigerator for that same reason. This is basil in the background of this slide. The other most fun thing about growing and talking about basil as a microgreen is that you get to enjoy its all slimy texture. When you hydrate basil, it absorbs water, and that mucilaginous material on the outside of the seed actually keeps it in place. So you get to enjoy that if you're growing in microgreens. Then, of course, we have cilantro. You all who are herb growers have probably grown cilantro, and so you know that it's that harder seed, it's slower germination. So I've grown it as a microgreen. I really like cilantro. I think it tastes great, but you have to be patient, and you're not going to get quite as good a yield. So I would kind of describe basil and cilantro as, yes, a little bit slow, but usually worth it, especially as we get into the warmer times of year. So, we're right here at the beginning of April. Of course, you guys are a little bit cooler than I am. I don't know, it's 50 degrees. It's a little chilly outside right now. So you might start with cool season crops right now. And then as the outside temperatures get higher, the light level gets higher, then move into some warm season crops, because you probably get better germination of your basil, in May, at the end of May, than you would right now anyway. A few extra notes on some of the soakers. Lots of times people will actually soak their pea seeds and let them take up water before they sow them. And it's one of the few that we cover. So peas can be really tasty if they work out, but if you overdo it and you get too much moisture in there, then you have to be careful about mold. But pea shoots can actually get pretty high. You can harvest several inches, and so they can be a pretty good yielding crop. You don't have to wait till they get tall. You can harvest at any stage that's desired. I tend to let them get 6 inches or so on there. An interesting element, of course, this when you think about germination, is that the color depends upon how much light we're giving them. So some of the high-end microgreens growers will be promoting golden pea shoots, and the golden is actually just yellow, not very much chlorophyll, because they haven't been exposed to light. Some people actually get multiple harvests out of their peas. They don't take them all the way down to where the stem comes out of the seed. They leave a little bit of height. I typically just harvest mine once and go, because it's more straightforward. You get a little bit higher yield that first time, and I would just rather turn over the crops, get new media, start clean, all of those types of things. But pea microgreens are one of my favorite ones to eat as well. Some people also grow sunflowers, and sunflowers I actually haven't grown quite as much. They do require pre-soaking, and so then they're actually laid out in the media, and if you can keep those seeds from drying out, sometimes they might not actually need to be covered. Sometimes growers for sunflowers and microgreens will actually have a weight or something on top of them so that you don't get as much stem elongation out of your sunflowers. So I would wait till you get a little bit of experience with some of the other easier ones to grow, and then maybe branch out into sunflowers. Some of the others to consider: amaranth. I'll have a picture here in just a couple of slides. Amaranth is actually one of my favorites to grow as well. It's of course, we all know amaranth. We know it as red root pigweed and other unappealing things in our gardens. And so this is just the type that's more grown for leaf rather than for seed. I think that it kind of tastes a little bit like spinach. So it has a little bit of an earthy flavor, and it's a warm season crop. So it can be a good follow up if you're growing in a greenhouse or a porch or someplace outdoors in the summertime when your conditions are fairly high. Mung bean is grown much like peas. You may be familiar with mung bean more as a sprout. Onions, we can grow them from seed. They are slow. And both onions and chives will have a lower volume harvest. It's just a smaller, thinner leaf, and so they can be a great flavor profile. But I'm not sure that I would spend the time with them in microgreens. You may be already growing bunching onions or green onions and chives in your herb garden. I'd probably just use those. This is actually amaranth, and this is being overhead watered. That's not my preference, but I will say that it does provide you with pretty photo ops. I prefer to bottom water mine and keep my stems dry. There are also some people who do some grasses and grains, so wheatgrass for folks who juice. Lots of times those will also be a soaking item. I don't actually grow grass a lot to juice myself. When I worked in hydroponics, we grew a lot of barley as an animal feed. So I'm more used to it, you know, in mass, more as a forage crop rather than as a human crop. So it works well for goats and chickens and things like that. All right, so that's a little bit of an overview of some of the main crops that we're going to use. When it comes to the practical aspects of growing microgreens, we want to choose seeds that are, this is the most important thing, right? Absolutely untreated. Lots of times when you'll buy microgreen seeds, you may not get any information about the cultivar. Sometimes these might be older, open pollinated, all those types of things. And the cultivars aren't really that important for us when we're harvesting them at only a couple weeks old. The disease resistance and those kinds of things that we're a lot more interested in as far as our broccoli and cabbage and all those types of crops, they're less important. We can pretty much use any of our garden vegetables that are edible as the plant, right? We don't eat peppers, we don't eat tomatoes, right? But most of our brassica crops and our leafy crops are game. And sometimes a fun way to start with microgreens is if you have some leftover seeds from previous year's gardens, because you can seed them kind of thick and not worry if you have a little bit lower germination percentage, so you could get your feet wet a little bit that way. Most of the time when I buy seeds for microgreens, I'll buy it in a half pound or something as a bulk because I'll be using quite a bit. So when it comes to containers, you have a whole range of options. Some people use everything from old cafeteria trays, just any shallow tray will work. A lot of what we grew microgreens in as trial and research here in our greenhouse was actually half flats. So, you know, a 10 by 20 seating flat is a couple inches tall, but these are about half the depth. And so you don't need near as much media, and they're a lot easier to harvest. This is actually one of the seedling trays that we use a lot in the greenhouse. Sometimes if I'm doing demonstrations and growing a lot of different cultivars, I'll use one of these divided. But you can use a whole array of fruit containers, of 4-inch pots, right? Just simple plastic pots. The depth is not a huge concern. We want at least a couple inches so that the media doesn't dry out really fast. But how deep it is just kind of depends on how much you want to baby it. If we have 3 or 4 inches in a pot, then it's going to dry out slower. And so we have a little bit more margin as far as our management. What I would say about containers is don't overthink it. One of my favorite containers, this is actually a blueberry container. The most important thing about containers, right, is that they're clean. And so you can actually go online and order just 50 quantities, like large quantities of these little blueberry containers. And they have a nice little lid that you can shut for retaining just a little bit of humidity as you're germinating. And then you can pop the lid off when the germination occurs. So this is actually a red leaf amaranth. And this picture was taken from microgreens that were growing in the windowsill of my office. So you can easily get a couple of inches of growing media there. I just use ProMix. I use regular greenhouse media quite a bit. And so there's a lot of options that you can do for containers. Here's some examples in more traditional greenhouse pots. When it comes to media, there are several options. The reason that I highlighted soilless mix is because honestly, I think it's one of the easiest and most straightforward to use. It is essentially sterile, so that lowers our risk as far as damping off and some of the things that some of the plant pathogens that we would worry about. Some of our germination mixes also will have just a little bit of nutrition in there, and that can be an asset because we're going to be growing for a couple of weeks, and then we don't have to deal with fertilizer as much. I'll show you some pictures here in just a little bit of some of the thin paper options that you have. Some of the commercial growers are using thin polylactic acid or even a polymer type material. I think that for us in the home growing situation, a greenhouse mix is easier for us to use. It dries out slower. We can bottom water. All of those things make it a pretty attractive mix. And of course, you know, the difference between transplant and germination mix is all about the particle size. So if I only have an inch or two of media, then I'll probably go ahead and use a germination mix because it'll hold a little bit more water. I may have more vermiculite than I do perlite in it. If I've got it 2 or 3 inches deep, or say in a 4-inch pot, I'll probably just go ahead and put regular transplant mix in it that has a little bit larger perlite size so that it'll drain faster. But here we go. This is really our goal. We just want good seed to media contact, and we simply sprinkle the seeds on top, mist them, get them moist, and let them do their thing. This is one of the paper materials that I was talking about, and so this is just a thick single-use paper. So once again, we have a good sterile media that we can grow on. The downside of this is that it doesn't have any nutrition. So for some of our slower growing crops, we may need to fertilize a little bit or just hope we get a fast harvest and turnaround. So when it comes to a few of the management aspects, these are the last couple of things I wanted to share with you. We've got light, we've got temperature, and we've got moisture. So of course, if you had a small greenhouse or someplace that you could grow in, that would be ideal because you have very good light conditions. But I think the most important thing to think about when we're talking about environmental conditions and growing location is to keep in mind that even though they're tiny, these are still warm and cool season crops. So provide them with a similar type of growing environment that you would if you were growing them for a much larger crop. So that kind of brings in the winter versus summer. I'm going to grow my cool season crops more in the winter and the early part of the spring, grow my warm season crops more in the summer, because unless we have supplemental light or a really well lit area in the wintertime, we're probably going to be a little bit limited as far as light. Once we get warmer, we could actually be providing too much light for these small crops if we're growing them in a greenhouse. So we might actually start them on some of our partially shaded lower benches. We're not growing on this scale, so don't get overwhelmed. I just think this is a beautiful picture of a whole lot of microgreens. When it comes to growing indoors, think of this as very similar to seedling production. In fact, if you're growing some tomatoes and peppers right now, just slip in a few microgreens right beside of them. The window method can work well if you have a well-lit window. Just be careful about the heat, especially in the summertime, and how fast your media dries out. So I already kind of mentioned these when I talked about lettuce, arugula. Some of those could do better with indoor light, a little bit lower light levels. Basil, probably not going to be your best option for those lower light levels. In my house, actually even in my office, I don't know if you can see that up there, I even have like grow lights just, hanging and in various locations. So if you have small fluorescent, or they actually make LED lights that can be switched out of T5 fluorescent lights now. So there are lots of small scale, pretty cost effective ways that you can get a little bit of light. And if you are successfully growing tomato or pepper transplants, you absolutely have enough light for microgreens. In fact, you could probably get by with a little bit less on your microgreens. So here, this is a fairly sophisticated system. This is a polymer material that some more commercial growers would use. Here you have a really good example of a home system. You probably want to get 8 to 10 hours of light on them a day if you're going to do supplemental light, but you can grow a lot of microgreens in the space of, say, a 2-foot supplemental light. When it comes to seeding, most of the time I'll just loose broadcast seed those, and it's a little bit of a learning process. You don't want seeds piled up on top of each other, definitely. I try to make sure that my seeds don't touch. But how loosely or densely I seed them has to do with airflow, it has to do with moisture. So if you have good under container watering and you have good airflow, you can seed a little bit thicker. But I'd probably start off with kind of a little bit more lessly dense seeded and kind of work your way up so that you don't have any damping off or something that is kind of a bummer on your first try. For the most part, you don't really need to cover that. You can for a couple of days. Just be careful that you don't leave the cover on once you already have emergence, because then you'll just get gangly seedlings. Most of the time, if you have good moisture in your growing mix, that'll be enough to maintain moisture in your seeds. But just don't have a whole lot of, say, fast moving air or something that's going to dry out those seeds while you're trying to get them germinating. The kitchen sprinkler on your sink can work well. You need to overhead water them at least once, right, to get them all watered in. But be just gentle initially, because we're talking about really small seeds, and if you hit them with a water hose sprinkler, you'll literally just spew those seeds everywhere. When it comes to watering after you get them established, then I always try to bottom water if possible. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I like those blueberry containers, because they have nice little slits on the bottom and they're very easy to bottom water. So you want to be picky about your water source. You absolutely want clean water, clean municipal water, or well water. Don't reuse it, just use it once. Don't drain it through and then use it again. We want to be picky with the water that we use on these really small eat and roll seedlings. The other important thing about water is, especially if you're using that paper material, but even if you're using seedling mix, don't use softened water. And because a softener typically replaces the calcium and the magnesium in your water with sodium. And so adding a whole bunch of additional salt to these young plants could lower their germination or lower their growth. I kind of already mentioned a little bit about one of the reasons that I like seedling mixes, because it has some fertilizer in the media, and that's pretty handy. Most of the time that'll get us where we need to go. If you're starting to really see yellowing and it's been a couple, 3 weeks in production, then you could give them a dilute fertilizer solution, but go easy on it. They don't need too much. When it comes to harvest, in fact, harvest and storage, I don't really even like to store them. I just like to harvest them right before I want to eat them. And most of the time you'll want to cut, make sure you're using nice clean utensils. Here you can see he's even using gloves when he harvests. Most of the time with a small container, you can just tip them up and do a pretty nice, neat job without getting any media on there. How you harvest kind of depends upon the container that you're using. If you're gonna store them, then don't wash them before you store them, because that water could sitting in there could make them break down sooner. But I wouldn't really even store them. That's the best part about having them growing right there in your house, is that you harvest them right before you need to use them. So as we wrap this up, some of the interesting and fun things about microgreens are that they don't really take a lot of time or money. You can start very small, very small. Don't be afraid to experiment. There is no big concerns about failure. If they damp off and fall over, you just start them again the next week and water them a little bit less the next time. So everything can be fixed. If you want to try it at home, pick 2 or 3 of these that sound interesting. You could use some of the older seed that you have, or you could buy a new microgreen seed. Is actually not that expensive. You can get a half a pound for just a few dollars for a lot of these. I have talked about these a lot as single species because, I'm a horticulturist, and so that's the way I think. But if you go to Johnny's or some of the seed catalogs, a lot of what you'll find for microgreens are mixes spicy mix, a more mild mix. And so that can be a great way to get your feet wet because they'll provide you with a range of cool season crops in there. So great flavor, short cycle, and a joyful addition to our winters and spring at home. So thank you for your attention. And Pam, I think that wraps up my presentation.
All right, we have some questions. So if you would, can you grow microgreens in an aero garden?
I have never seen it done. So when you say air garden, I guess what I'm interpreting is like a hydroponic tower or something where we have some dripping or some spraying on the roots. I mean, I would say that, I mean, it wouldn't be impossible, but it might just be more logistically challenging than would be beneficial, because it's just easier to transplant single plants into a lot of those air gardens and other hydroponic systems. Most of the time when I've seen these grown hydroponically, they've been in a circulating system with a mat. And that's good on a large scale, but honestly for us, you know, a small tray is probably the simplest.
Okay. Should you soak cilantro seed since it is hard?
You can do a little bit of pre-soaking on cilantro. It would probably help you out as far as getting it going a little bit faster. When I have grown it as a microgreen, I've typically grown in a greenhouse room where I can keep a pretty high humidity, and so I didn't cover it up, and it did fine, but pre-soaking would probably be helpful.
Okay. And where do you find the best seeds?
I would buy microgreen seeds from suppliers that you already know and trust for high quality seeds in other areas. So a lot of our seed companies that cater to, you know, picky gardeners and small scale farmers like Johnny's, like High Mowing, like Territorial, all of those places are going to be a good source, because a lot of the people who grow microgreen seeds are going to be small direct market farmers, and that's where they get a lot of their seeds. So those companies are going to have a good idea of what works well, and they're probably going to have high quality product.
Should they be washed before consuming?
You should manage your microgreens with the best management food safety practices, just like you would for fresh leafy greens coming out of your garden. So yeah, you know, you'd want to watch those just like you would your baby greens and your lettuce, and manage those in a way that, to the best of our ability, we're following all those best management food safety practices. When I was mentioning the moisture in the containers, that was more just a storage issue. If there's water sitting in those containers, it could cause them to deteriorate faster.
Is it true that microgreens have 5 times the level of vitamins and carotenoids of a mature plant?
Well, the orders of magnitude, I would have to get back with you on that. So in the nutritional density research that I've read, it depends a lot on the growing conditions. It depends on the species. And so they can have more, but I would not necessarily stake, you know, my claim on 5 times. But actually, what I can do, Pam, if you want to, I can send you a couple of nutrient density papers on microgreens, and people can kind of comb through and look at those. But carotenoids are definitely one of the ones that are frequently researched.
Okay, I can link those on the website right by the handout. Good. Can you reuse the media for a second crop? And then the second follow-up is, if you can't, what do you do with the used media?
You probably could use it again, but honestly, when it comes to plant productivity and the food safety elements, I would just rather use it once. And it can be good. You can take it to your raised bed. You can put it in, you know, containers on your porch to grow other vegetable crops. So we're not really talking about a large volume of media. So I would just, I just put it in one of my other growing containers and clean my container and go again with fresh media the next time.
Okay. I've tried growing broccoli sprouts in moist mix, covering, and then when I saw a few at a ½ inch, uncovered them. So few germinated. I also tried in a jar, same thing. Ratio of germinated seeds very low. What am I doing wrong?
I mean, it might actually be that there's just too much moisture. And when I was talking about to cover or not to cover, I mean, my general premise is that if my media is pretty moist, then I don't necessarily worry about covering. And it may be that and the other thing that I would say is with low germination, I mean, it could be the seeds, the seed lot, or if they're older, but it also could be temperature. If it was moist and it was really warm, we could actually decrease the germination percentage.
Nutrition facts. Any cool season crops better for vitamins?
I mean, I think that a lot of our brassica crops, broccoli and things like that, are crops that have been tested a lot. And so there's pretty good data on those. I will say that the ones that stick out in my mind are the ones that tended to be lower on the nutrient density scale. And those were peas, right? Some of my favorites. So a lot of the plants that we would, eat for higher nutrient density as a more mature crop would also be good as a smaller crop. But there will be more detail in that publication that I send you, Pam.
If you used a blueberry container, how much seed would you use?
So we're talking about a pretty small seeded crop like arugula or like kale. I mean, I'd probably start with, an 1/8 to a 1/4 teaspoon. And you want to sprinkle it so you don't really have seeds touching. And then actually, this picture, I didn't do this on purpose. I could pretend like I did. The basil over here is actually scattered at a pretty good density. The arugula over here on the right is a little bit heavy. There's some spots that the seeds are just a little bit too close together. So I'd kind of start with an 1/8 teaspoon and then maybe build up if you don't see any issues with, with damping off or something.
Have you grown popcorn? If so, does it germinate easily?
I haven't grown it, but I have seen a little bit of research on that. I would think that as long as we had warm enough soil conditions, it would germinate okay. Now it's going to be a little bit larger seeded, so it might be a little bit slower, and we may actually have to cover it. If I see anything on that, I'll send information to Pam, but I don't have personal experience with popcorn.
When you clean and repurpose your containers, do you use a little bleach or other disinfecting product?
Yeah, I'd use dilute bleach solution so that you would, reduce not only any human pathogens, but definitely pathogens too. So yeah, good idea.
Have you ever used coconut fiber as a media for growing microgreens?
I haven't used core as much, but most of the, the positive attributes of peat, I would also attribute to coconut core. So I don't really have any hesitation about it. I would think that it would do, pretty well as a thin layer of growing media. Holds water very well.
Okay. What can a greenhouse grow in winter? I'm in Zone 6, Lancaster, Ohio.
Well, what you can grow is probably mainly limited by how much money you're willing to spend keeping the temperatures high enough. So, with just a little bit of additional light in those areas, you could grow kale, you could grow spinach, you could grow a range of those leafy crops. But I mean, to get very fast growth, you'd probably want to, heat that to at least 45 or 50 degrees at night. So it's more about how much you're willing to invest in heating, because you can get pretty good growth out of a lot of those leafy crops. with a little bit of supplemental light and a little bit of supplemental heat.
All right, that is the final question. I do have one final comment from Linda Hutzel. You are inspiring me to give it a shot. Thank you.
Well, good. I hope you get a little bit of fun April inside time before the real garden season kicks in outdoors.
There you go. So what I'm going to do now is launch a quick poll for you to answer. If all of you would please go through this poll and provide your answer, then we'll share the poll results at the end. In addition, just a few other reminders before we close. Tomorrow's Horticulture Lunch and Learn, Thursday, April 2nd, is Jacqueline Kowalski, Best Practices for MGV and Community Garden Projects. All of the information will be held on the State Master Gardener website on the home page. So when you get to that website, go to the very top of the page where it says news, and you will see the information for the Horticulture Lunch and Learn and Horticulture Happy Hour registrations. We'll give the polls just a couple more seconds. Again, you will see the link there, and then register for additional ones, and they will all start to come out as we get more lined up here, and hopefully we'll go through the end of August. I think we said we'd go to August. So with that, here are the results of your poll. Please rate this webinar 4s and 5s on outstanding. 100% of the people learned something new today, Natalie. 86% are going to start microgreens. And moods today are in the pretty good to excellent range. And then the final question, how many people are logged in? Most people have one person per, and a few have some extra ones. So I just wanted to check how many people are actually seeing these webinars. I had one young lady yesterday said she shared it with her grandson, her 9-year-old grandson, and they just really enjoyed it. So got new audiences out there, Natalie.
Yeah, a little bit of homeschooling going on.
Yeah, no kidding. With that, we want to thank Natalie again very much for doing this, and always keep that Buckeye sign up above Rocky Top, because, you know, it's always go Bucks, right?
Absolutely.
All right, Natalie, and everybody else, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate what you do, and we enjoy working with you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a great day.
Bye.